Welcome, everybody. This is part of a series that the museum has been doing for the last few years. There are 5 fireplace chats, and as you can see, we have a fake fireplace behind us to give it some aura of authenticity, if you will. We've been fortunate to have some really great people, and we have one again today, and that's Bruce Kennett. Now, his biography is so interesting. I'd like to read it, but I promised I wouldn't do that. We'll get it out of him little by little in a career that exceeds 50 years, I think. So where were you born?
Boston, Massachusetts, MGH.
And was anybody in your family involved in printing, graphic design, anything like that?
My dad was an architect, so there was some focus on lettering and so on, but no.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to elementary school and junior high and first 2 grades of high school in Conway, New Hampshire, and then got shipped off to Exeter, New Hampshire for 2 years. Then went briefly to UNH, went to live in Grenoble for a year in France, and went to the university there and the Pedagogical Union of Architecture, and then came back and got my degree from Shimer College, which was this cool little great book school in far-flung Western Illinois, where 10 people would sit around a table and talk for an hour and a half about whatever they'd read the night before. No lectures, all discussion classes. So it was actually an amazingly good foundation. The most you could major in at Shimer was humanities, social sciences, natural sciences, or philosophy. And everybody had to take all the same courses, which, as you look ahead to what I had to deal with, any book project that came in, I had at least some ability to grasp what the content was because of that general education. So I was very grateful for that later on.
So at this point now, you have a degree in what?
Humanities.
Okay. When did graphic design enter all of this?
Well, when I was in 11th grade, this guy, George, sat next to me in French class. And although I loved France later, I was bored in French class in 11th grade. And he had an Osmeroid pen and was writing A, B, C, D, E, F, G in italics. And I said, George, where'd you get that pen? He said, oh, I got it at the store over there. So I started teaching myself italics using Edward Johnston's book as the primary teaching vehicle.
The Bible, if you will.
And I had become very good at mechanical drawing, working in my dad's architectural office and after hours help and summer jobs and so forth. So I gradually turned toward that, but I still thought I was going to be an architect. But I kept gravitating always toward, well, I want to design the title blocks for these drawings, and I want to do the finished presentation drawings. I'm less interested in the 3D design aspects that compel most people to go into architecture. So that's when I first started thinking about it. And it wasn't until 1972 when my friend Jeff and I moved from Shimer College out in Illinois to Boston. We started going to the BPL, which had a great graphic design collection, and looking at those books. And of course, then that same year, I discovered Dwiggins stuff.
So at this stage, what is your job? Where do you work?
I started out working for an architect and then applied to Charette. I don't know how many of you guys remember Charette, the great art supply store, but I applied for a job running a blueprint machine at Stone's, but I said I wanted to do design work in the catalog. And they couldn't, the people filling the job couldn't handle that request, so they sent me to see the president, who then hired me to be his assistant. So I was Blair Brown's assistant for 3 years at Charette, testing products, and I wrote a piece called Notes on Type Sizes. The architects were really confused because we had Letraset, which was Anglo-American points and picas, and we had Normatype, which was Didot. And so 72-point Helvetica wasn't the same size in those 2 sheets of transfer lettering. So I ended up writing a piece to try to explain how type was described and why the sizes were different. So that's when I first really began to pay attention to type.
And Charette was a great learning ground because they handled all kinds of equipment products, supplies, paper, everything. So you probably learned a great deal there in terms of the industry.
I did, and we were the largest dealer of Letraset in the world at that point. And in fact, I was sent at one point to England by the company and went to Letraset's factory down in Kent, which was like a NASA clean room, and it had these web presses of polyethylene, a web of polyethylene that would come down and then be silk screened with super high accuracy on the sheets. I went to Winsor and Newton and saw these mills where they were refining the pigments, grinding the pigments down from minerals. And I asked one of the operators, how long will this take? And he said, I don't know yet. It's just, we just have to wait until it's done. However long it takes, that's what it takes. And there were elderly women building the Series 7 sable brushes because it turned out they had the best ability to select the hairs and shape them and put them into the ferrules to make those brushes. So again, that was all because of my being at Charette. I got to see those things.
Okay, so now you've gone through this learning curve here. What do you do next?
Well, I had been using calligraphy as a means of writing fancy envelopes and copying out poems and so on, strictly English style, Edward Johnston, Greeley Hewitt line of looking at things. And a friend of mine said, oh, there's an exhibit at the Busch Reisinger at Harvard. Want to go to it? It's calligraphy. I said, sure. It was Friedrich Neugebauer's first big show in the United States. His friend Walter Grossman, who was at University of Massachusetts Libraries, and his wife, who worked at Widener, arranged for this show at the Busch Reisinger. And I went that night to the opening, and I couldn't sleep all night. I was so excited by the colors and the shapes of the letters. They were very different than what I was used to seeing in the English school of, well, we too can reproduce this 9th century Winchester hand. Neugebauer's teacher, Larisch in Vienna, was using neon in the 20s and 30s, was using neon and hammered metal and bent cork. And he was connected with the Jugendstil people and the Wiener Werkstätte and so on. So there were this whole encyclopedic volcanic eruption of textures and colors that Neugebauer was using. So I went back the next day I took time off from Charette, and I went the next day, and there he was. And I had written out something from Kloikens, something that I'd copied out of Hermann Zopp's Manuale Typographicum about how the practitioners of the black arts have to be subservient to the author, and they support the word of the author rather than being the primary expressor the way, say, a painter would be. And I gave it to Neugebauer. He spoke no English. I spoke no German, but we both spoke French, and we had this 2-hour conversation, and he invited me to come to Austria to study with him. So I did.
Oh, wow. There's an opportunity right there. And how long did you do that?
I did that for a year. I couldn't get a student loan, but the little town where I grew up, the president of the bank knew me, said I was of good character, and he would loan me $4,000 as a commercial loan with no countersignature from anybody else. And that was a huge event in my young life that somebody would say, I believe in what you're doing. So off I went. And at the end of that year, Neugebauer asked me to stay on as his assistant, but I applied for a job at Linotype.
Now, were they still in Brooklyn, or were they in Long Island at that point?
They were in Long Island and Penn Station in New York.
Mm-hmm.
So I went and spent several days with Mike Parker, and he had 4 lieutenants at that point: Matthew Carter, Sherry Cohn, Lorna Shanks, and Steve Byers. And I was going to be the 5th lieutenant, and I was going to be a liaison between the type design studio at Penn Station and manufacturing out on Long Island, and develop a whole series of templates for people to use to design, to produce letterheads and newsletters and things like that. And I wasn't sure about living in New York on what was then on offer quite a meager salary. And so they took me to Cold Spring Harbor. Mike kept saying, you'll love it here, you'll love it here. So they made sure that I rode with Steve, who had this very fancy Griffith sports car. And we went out to Cold Spring Harbor in Long Island, and we had this big picnic. And Mike said, see, it's just like the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And I said, well, I don't think I can work in New York. And so I actually turned down that job and went back to Cambridge and worked there until I moved to Maine in 1980.
What happened was Mergenthaler was in Brooklyn from almost the very beginning. And then in the 1960s, they moved out to Long Island, so Plainview, Long Island. Then they moved to another town, I forget Melville. And then they moved to a place called Hauppauge. And Mike Parker was the head of the typographic division and probably a legend in the industry. And I was one of the few people that also worked for Mike in my career at Mergenthaler. And then Mike left with that whole gang that you mentioned, and they formed Bitstream. And they were in Cambridge, and they provided digital fonts at that time. By the way, I have a complete set of every Bitstream font on the 3.5-inch floppies, if you ever need them.
The other fascinating thing about Mike is his depth of interest in Arthurian legend. He could go on for hours about all, was King Arthur real, and in what ways was this manifest in the buildings that are still there, and so on.
I was delivering the mail to his office one day when we were in Brooklyn, and I had read a memo from somebody about a font called Clarendon. And I said, Mr. Parker, what's a Clarendon? And he always had these big sheets of white paper on his desk, and he cleared everything, and he drew for me the history of the serif. I wish I had saved that sheet. That'd be invaluable. All right, so you've now declined linotype. You're back in New England. You're moving to Maine. Why?
Daniel Boone always needed more elbow room, and I kept going I was pretty comfortable in Cambridge, but I moved out to Waltham because it was less crowded. Then I moved back into Cambridge at the very end of the 1970s, but I kept sending people to Maine saying Maine's a really cool place. So I just uprooted and moved to Maine without knowing anybody and set up a business there doing design and photography as a joint discipline right down in the old port of Portland.
And how did you get to the very famous printer in Portland?
Oh, the Athalinthia Press. They were on the opposite side of Exchange Street from where I was living, and I would stop in and visit with them, and they had linotype machines right in the window.
That's right. You could watch them set type on a linotype.
So it was a wonderful curiosity, these sort of exposed brick, asparagus fern, shishi restaurants in the old port and these fancy shops, and then you look in the next window, there's these guys setting type on a linotype. So anyway, I got to know them, and I had a business partner for a couple of years, and we decided to go our separate ways. And so I went over there, and they knew who I was. I knew what they were doing, and recently there'd been a new owner, so he hired me to come and be managing director. And we had this vast quantity of hand type in the basement that Fred Anthoensen had bought in the 20s and 30s. He was a Danish immigrant, moved over at age 2, went to high school. He worked as the printer's devil in this place called the Southworth Press. And then he worked his way up. And by the 1920s, he was the manager of the Southworth Press. Then he bought into the company and became Southworth Anthoensen Press. And eventually it was just the Anthoensen Press. So we had these beautiful 40-inch, 38-inch Mergenthaler. They were made by Nebbiolo in Italy, the sort of swan song of letterpress cylinder presses. They had double sheet detectors and gas jets to dry the ink on coated paper. They were just amazing presses. And we had this very skilled linotype department, 2 people in the proofroom reading live proof to each other for the utmost inaccuracy, because our clients were the American Oxonian, the papers of the Bibliographical Society, the American Neptune, published by the Peabody Museum, and all these academic and scholarly works needed to be squeaky clean proofread. So that's the situation that I walked into, and my assignment was to bring the press into the 20th century and add offset. So we put in a Mealy Favorite, a small offset press, and we bought a monotype laser comp and a Penta front end to run that, so that professors could send us their manuscripts and we could on floppy, and we could then take that in without having to rekey everything on the linotypes.
So you had a Penta, but the Penta system was a data general computer programmed to do typesetting. And which model monotype was it?
It was a laser comp. I don't remember anything other than that.
That was the first laser typesetting machine as such. And there weren't very many of them that were sold in America, so you had some challenges, I bet.
Yeah, the main reason that we bought that rather than a linotype machine, in those days it would have been a Linotron, was that our customers seemed very interested. A lot of their books were set on the monotype metal machines in the old days, and so we could offer them, for instance, I bought Times 727. The regular Times New Roman 327 has heavy caps. All the capital letters are darker on the page than the lowercase. The German market said, we can't take that because we have capital letters every time there's a noun. So they developed a second version called 727 light caps, and we bought that to use when people wanted to have their copy set in Times Roman.
So you're making the transition from hot metal to photographic typesetting, computer typesetting. Any really interesting projects you've done there? Because Athalinthia was known as the highest quality printer in America. And there, even to this day, people will admit to that. By the way, I've gone there many times. Supposedly there's a plaque on the building that says that the Athalinthia press was there. I have never been able to find that plaque. Did you take it?
And of course it moved. Athalinthia was up, well, first it started on Exchange Street, then it moved up to a building where it was for many years, and then there was a catastrophic fire in the 60s, and many things were lost. Then they moved back down to Exchange Street, but every day as I came into work, I saw a painting of a British corvette in the War of 1812 in Portland Harbor when the British shelled Portland, painted by Dwiggins as a gift to Fred Athalinthia because they were great friends.
What happened to that painting?
Henry Thomas, the owner who bought Athalinthia in the 1980s, still has it as far as I know.
Oh, wow. Okay, so what happens next?
Well, and I'll just say one project that I especially love that we did there, the Rolls Royce of telegraph keys, the Vibraplex, made on its own dots. You had to make a dash, but telegraphers had what back then was called glass arm. Now it would be called carpal tunnel. And if you were a high-end telegrapher, you bought your own key and brought it to work. You didn't use a company key. And the thing about the Vibraplex is it would make the dots itself. So if I wanted to type a B, send a B, that's dash, dot, dot, dot. So I would hold down the dash and then just relax and it would go dot, 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 and then I would stop it. Well, that hugely cut down on carpal tunnel stuff. So they were having a centennial of the Vibraplex key. So they were made right there in this kind of Dickensian sweatshop in Portland. I set that book and set all the running heads in Morse code because we knew that the only people who were going to buy this book were fluent in Morse code. So it was really fun to be able to put those running heads in the book.
That was my next question, so thank you very much.
Okay.
I was curious about the Morse code part of it. So, all right, so you're now at Athalinthia and you're about to leave, I'm assuming, to do what?
So in 84, on the spring equinox of 84, I left because the owner wanted to get rid of all the metal. He just wanted to be setting computer type and then jobbing out the printing. And I wanted the whole enchilada. I wanted to be working in a place where everything was together. And so I gave several months notice and then left. And at that point had bought a Macintosh SE and I just went out on my own to design books and make photo murals and that sort of thing.
Okay, so you got a Mac SE. What program?
Quark Express.
Okay, so now you're an independent graphic designer. Is that how you labeled yourself?
I think I just called myself a book designer and photographer.
Okay, and what's some of the interesting projects you've done? Or did?
I designed the lobby of LL Bean. And
okay, so you're up there in Maine, so that makes sense. Okay.
I designed the graphics for, well, that actually was earlier in the 80s. Well, the National Governors Conference is in a different state every year, and one year they were in Maine, so I designed all the graphics for that. Wrote a history of LL Bean, spent a couple of years, hired my good friend Bill Berry, who was a reference librarian, to work with me, and we put together a big book to mark the 75th anniversary of LL Bean. I did a wonderful book called A Noble and Dignified Stream for Old York Historical Society about the colonial revival period from the Civil War until the early 20th century and how it affected architecture, painting, literature, and so on. So I did a lot of different, I didn't work for any mainstream publishers. I mostly worked for private libraries, historical societies, that sort of thing.
In terms of your photography, I note that you referenced that you did aerials. Give me an example of what that was all about.
I would hire a Cessna and go up and shoot pictures. I also did landscapes. I worked with a view camera, which is the thing where it stands on a tripod and you go under the black cloth and it takes big sheets of film. So in the 90s, after I'd moved to New Hampshire, I was designing what's considered to be the world's first weather museum. And there was at the top of Mount Washington, there's a visitor center, and there's a 180-degree wall, curved concave surface that goes from west to north to east, and it was blank. And I said, that needs to have a backlit photo mural on it, like what you see when you're walking with your suitcase in the airport and you go past all those backlit color ads. So I went up into the instrument tower with my view camera and made 8 5-inch wide by 4-inch high Ektachrome exposures to cover 180 degrees. And then that was made into a photo mural by E.B. Luce in Worcester, which at that time was the oldest continuously running photo lab in the country, so that visitors could go up there when normally it's socked in with clouds. There's only 60 days a year when there's even partial visibility from Mount Washington. And so they come from, say, Sri Lanka, and they pay big bucks to go up the Cog Railway, and they get to the summit. They can't see anything because it's all socked in with clouds. So for about 20 years, that mural was up there for people to stand in front of, and it was as if they were looking out the windows one story above in the cafeteria, the exact same view of the Northern presidentials. Unfortunately, it was deemed not interactive enough, so they took it away, took it down. Have any of you seen that?
So when you say weather museum, I picture a fan and a sprinkler system. What's a weather museum?
Well, the observatory reports on the weather and does forecasting, and they also work for the government studying things like wing icing. So the FAA would hire them because the weather is so awful up there. And they held the world's record for highest wind speed ever recorded. 1931, it was 234 miles an hour. And so they had all these myriad tasks that were so arcane, nobody really understood what's going on. People would come up to the summit because it was a tourist destination, and the observatory wanted to help explain what work goes on there. So we had a museum with different sections devoted to wind speed, temperature, humidity, air pressure, and barometric pressure. And there were hands-on experiments that you could do at each one of these stations to begin to learn a little bit. What are the cloud types and what does that mean? What does that portend for the weather to come? So that people could stop there for a few minutes and come away illumined in some way about what they were experiencing corporally with the weather.
So you've got a Mac SE, and of course, like the rest of us, the next version was the Mac 2. I assume you started moving up in Macs.
Mac 2X, then a Quadra 800.
It's amazing how desktop publishing sucked us in. And every year or two, we were buying another machine and another monitor. Oh, and then you had to keep the software up to date.
Well, and my biggest bugaboo, when I was little, my dad was an architect and he taught me how to use hand tools. And I also learned you save up and you buy the best tool you can afford, it then becomes transparent in your process. You don't think about it. You just do what you need to do. And my complaint about this is every time they would announce a new release, not only was 95% of it stuff that I would never use, but the tools kept changing position. And so the software interface kept interfering with what I wanted to do.
So as a designer now, you're growing. Your equipment is growing. Your skill levels are growing. You're starting to do more and more interesting projects. Give us the more interesting ones. Because there's a wide range of material for different organizations.
Yeah. Well, I wish I had my CV to look at right now, but I was doing everything from illustrated history books to these big photo murals. Boston College wanted its students to understand the underpinnings of our modern law in Anglo-American legal history. So I went to Runnymede Meadow, Lincoln's Inn in London, the courtroom where Sacco and Vanzetti were tried, the scene of the Boston Massacre, all these different places. And George Wyth's study in Williamsburg, where he taught Jefferson and Madison. All of these places sensed energies that had something to do with the formation of our legal history. So I made big photo murals and then accompanying paragraphs that were written by the professors at Boston College Law School to explain the importance of whatever this particular place was. And the students could then stand in front of this and imagine that they too might have a role in some of this. One that we never were able to put up, I was asked to photograph the Supreme Court. And as I was driving down, I was listening on the radio to the Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas hearings. And Thurgood Marshall's chair had been removed. There were only 8 chairs behind the bench. And that was going to be up behind the lectern in the freshman auditorium, where they would sit in seats looking down at the dais and the lectern, and above them would be the Supreme Court bench viewed from the presenter's lectern, so that again, they could feel, well, one day maybe I'll stand there and do that. But they remodeled the building and decided not to use that one.
So we're at a point now. I'd like to know when you fell in love with Bill Dwiggins.
1972.
Okay.
And I went home to North Conway. His assistant, Dorothy Abbey, known to some of you, I'm sure, was then installing all of the rooms at the Boston Public Library. Yale, Princeton, Dartmouth, Harvard, all these people had been competing for Dwiggins papers, but the city of Boston promised that they would make them open to the public and that they would put these 3 display rooms in Philip Johnson's addition, which was just being finished in 1972, that the newer part of the library that's away from Copley Square. And
By the way, they've redone the entire area there because Paul Shaw was there when he came for the last talk here, and he had difficulty finding things because they moved everything around.
well, and in fact, the 3 Dwiggins rooms that we all spent so much time looking at they're not even there anymore.
That's correct.
The materials are safe, but they're no longer on display.
Mm-hmm.
So my roommate Jeff and I were in the BPL all the time, and one day he met Dorothy. He immediately came and got me and introduced me to her. And that struck up a friendship that she and I maintained for many years afterward. I would go down to Hingham. She was then living in Dwiggins' studio, and I'd make a potato quiche, she'd make a pot of tea and a salad, and we'd have lunch and spend all day looking at Dwiggins' drawings, some of which had not yet been brought up to the BPL. And I went home when I was 22, I went home to visit my parents for the weekend, and I said, I have discovered the work of this really cool guy named Dwiggins. And they said, yeah. And I said, what do you mean, yeah? I said, well, you lived around the corner from him when you were a baby. So I was born at Mass General, and 3 days later, my mother and I went back to Hingham, where they were crashing with a fraternity brother of my dad's before we moved up to New Hampshire, to the old farm where I grew up. So the very first place I lived outside of Mass General was Hingham, a few blocks from where Mabel and Bill Dwiggins lived.
Yeah, I visited that house and took pictures of it. It's kind of a very common house. I would have thought that he made so much money that he would live in a better place.
He was not a user of resources in that way. He didn't own a car. He and Mabel were in rented housing for a while, and they bought that place in 1912, and they put 2 additions on it, one in 1915, one in 1925, but they just lived there contentedly. And then, of course, he built the place where Dorothy lived was the purpose-built studio that he designed in 1937.
So you've now discovered Dwiggins. How does this fit into your life's plan at this stage?
I was just a lover of his work, and with my modest purse went around and bought as many things as I could. I can remember going into Goodspeeds and finding a brand new unsold copy of a 1940 book that the Department of Graphic Arts at Harvard, Houghton Library, published called WAD to RR, and it's Dwiggins writing to Rudolf Ruzicka about how to design type, what his techniques and approaches are for that, as counsel to Ruzicka, who was in the process of designing Fairfield. And this book had been sitting there from 1940 until 1973, unsold, and it cost $15 brand new. So I bought that. So I did that through the 70s. And then Paula Carroll, who went on to be president of Society of Printers, was one of my students at Northeastern. And she said, at Book Builders, we have an award, the Dwiggins Award, but we don't all know why that award even exists. Would you come and talk about it? So with my knees knocking together at age 30, I put together a slideshow, and I went to the annual meeting of Book Builders, and that began a series of lectures that went on from 1980 till the present.
I should have brought out my Dwiggins Bowl from the award I got from Book Builders in 1984. However, Book Builders no longer exists, which is very sad.
It is.
Okay, so you're getting more involved. You're doing graphic design over here. You've now moved up north. What's happening in your life that's interesting involving design?
Well, when I was in Portland, I was very plugged into, I did a lot of work for advertising agencies. I made the label for Geary's Ale, which is this little, there's a lobster on it. I did it with 2 friends, Ed Zielinski and Bruce, can't remember his last name. So we wanted to make the label look as much like a 19th century thing as we could. So I was doing work for ad agencies, work for historical societies. Then when I moved to New Hampshire in 93, I occupied the barn where my dad still had his architectural office. Behind this farmhouse was a barn that was a working farm building until 1978 when he converted it to his office. So I moved in and just dumped all my stuff into the flat files that were there. And was back then, PDFs weren't happening yet. So FedEx was coming every day or two, and I was sending all these proofs to, those days I speak fluent French, so I was doing a lot of work for Heinley and Heinley designing textbooks that were in French. So working on those kinds of things. And just generally also teaching. Went to RIT to do some work there with the military photojournalism students, teaching at the Center for Creative Imaging up in Camden.
That was the organization that Kodak supported.
Kodak and Apple started it,
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And so in those days I was using Quark, and I would always have them, I had my students for a week, and the first half day I would bring speedball B-nibs and gridded paper, and I would ask the students to form letters, even if they weren't skilled at this, because I wanted them to understand the elastic properties of the white space between letters and how they worked with each other, because it would inform their use of any type after that. So again, there was this wanting to involve, maybe like some Montessori school, a manual act at the beginning of what otherwise was a week of digital keyboarding.
When do we start to work on the Dwiggins biography?
One of the important forces in my life was Rocky Steinauer, who had the printing company up in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont. And I first went there in 1972 with my partner Sylvia, and a couple of other friends, and I stayed in touch with Rocky. He encouraged me all along the way, as did Dorothy Abbey, both really important presences in my life. And I went to see Rocky in 2003, and I said, you know, there've been all these biographies of Paul Rand, all these different things, but there hasn't been a good biography of Dwiggins. There's the Postscripts book that was put out by the Typophiles around 1960, but there hasn't been a good book. And he said, well, you do it. And I said, no, it has to be somebody far more august than I am. And he said, no, you're the one who loves him. You do it. So in 2003, I had been doing some writing. I was editor-at-large for a wonderful magazine called Listener that reviewed music and the audio equipment that plays back music. So I had some experience with writing, and I had been writing for my client, Transparent Cable, but I had no idea how to do a biography. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to set off and do this. So in 2003, I started working on this, and my friend Sally took proposals to Knopf, because I thought where Dwiggins had done so much work for Knopf, Sonny Mehta responded by saying, we love the book, it's gorgeous, but we're a fiction house, we can't do nonfiction. And I said, yeah, but this is your own patrimony, your own history. They wouldn't do that. So I just went ahead and labored on it from 2003 into the teens. And then Princeton Architectural Press expressed some interest, but wanted a much smaller book. And in the end, Letterform Archive said, you know, we could do something. Rob Saunders had been a friend in the days of the Lettering Arts Guild. In the 70s, I was part of a group of calligraphers and stonecutters in Boston called the Lettering Arts Guild. Rob had just started Letterform Archive out in San Francisco, and he said, we're going to use crowdfunding to get the seed money to do this. We'll publish it for you. I said, okay, that sounds like a plan. So it took me 15 years of writing and research and 80 some trips, 3 hours each way down to Boston to the Dwiggins collection. And I would sleep in the basement of my friends in Brookline and just work there for 4 or 5 days, taking pictures and researching, gradually working on writing the book, which finally came out in the spring of 2018.
It says here it was published in 2017. So.
The title page says 2017, but there were several delays, not my responsibility, which meant that the book didn't come out until March of 2018.
That's a long time, but it's a 500-page book, and it is the most complete of any biography I've seen in this world of graphic design. And I understand it's out of print at this stage.
It is.
Any plans to bring it back?
Yeah, I'm hoping that we will see that again, and we'll see. I've been talking with Glenn Fleischman, who's been encouraging me. We'll see him next month here. Mm-hmm. So we'll see what happens with that. I think it's an important reference book, and I would love to see it out in the world again.
Now, you haven't stopped publishing because you just published an interesting book by Dwiggins. Tell everybody about this wonderful book.
So Dwiggins grew up on adventure stories, Treasure Island, New Arabian Nights, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And he commuted every day from Hingham on the train into Boston for 25 years. And to fill his time, he wrote out longhand these stories about a place called Athalinthia that's Uzbekistan 100 years ago, or Persia 1,000 years ago, who knows. And he used it as a vehicle for exploring foibles and false pride and jealousy and so on, and created all these stories, which he then tried to get published. And he took them around to Knopf, to George Macy, who started the Limited Editions Club, Arthur Rushmore at Harper's. No one would publish them. Meanwhile, he was doing illustrations for them too. So can you hand me the one on the left? So in 1928, he made a dummy that he took around to all the publishers with this exact title page. And this didn't exist at that point, but he had a complete dummy, this exact size. He tried assiduously to get it published, no one would take it on. He said, okay, well, I have plenty of other things to do. So he set it aside. Later on, one story was published in the Dolphin in the 1930s, and then he and his assistant Dorothy did a couple more in the 40s and 50s. But when I was doing research on the Dwiggins book, I discovered they're all here. All the stories, including all the illustrations that he made for them, are just sitting in the files. So I resolved back then in 2005 or whenever I found them that I would like to act as his agent over this gulf of time and bring the stories into print in the form that he wanted. So this is the deluxe, which was hand-bound by Gray Perot, the great binder up in Warren, Maine. And then a trade edition, which has an illustration from one of his stories, The War Against Walk, case-bound, and by Superior in Brockton, and printed, both versions printed by Penmore up in Maine, printers that I've worked with since 1980. And this is the mural that he painted on the dining room wall in 1925 showing Sinbad's home port. And so this seemed, where some of the adventurers in his Athalinthia stories are a little bit like Sinbad, this seemed like the perfect thing to have for the end leaves. So again, it was done through crowdfunding. It wasn't, the biography was supported by people from 43 different countries. This one was not so widespread because it's a narrower focus, but enough people gathered together to give me the resources to print this. And so now, bingo, what he most wanted in the late 20s to see in physical form, I can deliver to him.
What typeface did you use?
Caledonia.
Oh, it's a good thing. It had to be a Dwiggins font, otherwise we'd be in trouble. By the way, we have a number of these books signed by Bruce available if anybody wants them. The fact that they're signed means you can get more for them when you sell them on eBay someday. That'll work out. What are you working on now? Besides the update to the biography.
I'm going through my archives and I'm planting flint corn.
What is flint corn?
My partner Sylvia is a very accomplished gardener and grows most of the food that we eat. And I'm a very contented garden serf working outside in this huge organic garden that she's created. And so most recently I brought back from field grass 4 beds, an area maybe 20 by 30 or 20 by 40, something like that, ripped up all the turf, and we're planting flint corn in there, which can then be dried and ground to make cornmeal and polenta, things like that.
Says here you once drove a steam locomotive.
Yes. When I was in high school, one of the biggest employers was Storyland. Anybody here ever go to Storyland? Okay, well, in my day, there was a 15-inch gauge live steam locomotive, burned anthracite, which meant no smoke except if you pull the throttle back. And I got to drive that as a summer job. And there was a lot of theater involved in it. I would wait to put new coal on the fire until just before I pulled the throttle back to go up a grade so that people could see the smoke coming out the stack, because otherwise it was just, you couldn't see anything. So I did that, and unfortunately, the owner switched over to a 4-cylinder Jeep gasoline-powered motor and a fake chuffa-chuffa noisemaker inside the locomotive. So I had it the last year that they had the real steam locomotive. That was a wonderful job.
You've done some interesting things. Not only did you shoot photographs from a plane, you shot them from a hot air balloon.
Yes, and crashed. I was making a photograph of downtown Portland for a client whose entry hallway, the mural was going to be in the hallway, which means unlike many photo murals that are seen from a distance, this one people could walk right up to it. Same with the one on top of Mount Washington. People could put their noses against the glass. And so you don't want grain. You want the details to be finely resolved. So I knew I couldn't shoot out of a Cessna with a 35 millimeter camera or medium format. I had to use a view camera. And in those days, you couldn't get a gyro stabilizer unless it was FedExed from New York. Gyro stabilizer is what they use in Hollywood to control handheld cameras. So I took my 5x7 folding Deerdorf camera up in a balloon. The pilot didn't read the wind correctly, and we were blown out to sea. This was November 1st. And so I got the camera all set. It was my first time in a balloon. Got the camera all set up, and I looked over and realized, oh, we're going over what's in the foreground of my picture. And I said, where are we going? And he said, well, we're being blown out to sea right now. I said, you mean next stop, Portugal? And he said, that's right. So he went up and down, up and down. He finally found one layer of wind that was blowing back toward the coast. So we crash landed on Mackworth Island, which is just off the coast near Falmouth. And when we hit, I got thrown against a propane tank, broke my tailbone.
Oh, gosh.
So that was a painful experience. And I had ordered through ILL a copy of, what's the name of can't think of his name now, the aerial photographer who worked in balloons. And Daumier did a wonderful thing saying this guy raising photography to the level of art. I can't think of his name now. But anyway, that autobiography came showing all these crashes that he'd been through. And I wondered if I had read that first, would I have gone up in the balloon? Probably I still would have.
I cannot picture you retiring. What is your average day like?
Well, it's serene and beautiful at our place in Vermont. And it involves reading, being in touch with people, doing some writing, doing some gardening, just a rich and wonderful variety of things, absent the insistent pressure of deadlines. The deadlines are now self-imposed. I'd love to do a book that has the letters of Dwiggins, Ruzicka, and Rollins, who were all very mutually supportive. Rollins went from this pinko lefty community in central Massachusetts to working for the man at Yale and railed against all the sort of corporate clamps that were put on him. And he talked about that with Ruzicka and Dwiggins. And so I'd love to do those guys all supporting each other in their careers. And Ray DeBole, Chicago lettering artist who worked with Oz Cooper, is another kind of twinkly-eyed, avuncular character like Dwiggins, who did wonderful calligraphy. There's a book called The Recollections of the Lyceum Circuit and Chautauqua Circuit. I don't know if you have it in the library. It's entirely hand-lettered, the whole book, 200 pages. I'd love to do a biography of him. All of his stuff is at the Newbury Library.
It's great to see that you're still intellectually happy and involved in the industry. This is fantastic. What do you think we're going to see next in terms of work about Dwiggins? Besides you, are there other people working on things?
Well, Paul Shaw is always working on Dwiggins. I don't know that anything else is going to come along. He's, other than some people who are interested in him, and I like to think that my biography has expanded interest in that, he's so interested in ornament that he's still kind of off on the sidelines a little bit. And my mental picture is that my biography kind of tugged at his elbow and pulled him out onto the stage where he could be better seen. But I wish more work could be done about him, but I don't know that of anything that's happening now.
It is said that Dwiggins coined the term graphic design. Is that true?
I would say he was one of the first writers to use the term graphic design. Paul Shaw has been very studious in proving that somebody else used it before Dwiggins. It was...
That article, by the way, there's a print of it in the corner over there. Paul Shaw gave us permission to reproduce it, that has the entire history of the term graphic design.
Right. So I would prefer to think of Dwiggins as one of the first writers to use graphic design as a term in 1922.
Mm-hmm. He also did a lot of his art with stencils. Has anybody really documented that area?
Not in detail, and sadly, the material that served him best is celluloid, and celluloid shatters over time. Acetate lives over the decades much better, but it's hygroscopic, which means if you're using gouache And Dorothy complained about this. In 1950, she did there was a wonderful group called the Distaff Side, group of women prominent in printing who would put books together. And she did an 8-page insert for that. And the acetate stencils kept shifting and going out of register because they swelled from the water. So celluloid, which was his preferred material, and knives made by him from hacksaw blades. He ground his own knives before X-Acto blades. The physical stencils, many of them, you look in the file folder and there are just 200 shards in the bottom of the folder, unfortunately. Some of them are okay. But I think that whole technique of using stencils is one of his greatest inventions. And the beauty of the stencil, he started out with wooden stamps, which he would carve on the end of maple and cherry blocks of wood, type-I blocks of wood. But the beauty of the stencils is not only can you see the work underneath, but you can also flip the image over and have the same thing facing in the other direction.
If there was any part of your life that you could redo, what part would it be? By the way, these questions he had no idea what I was going to ask.
Maybe I would have stayed longer in Austria with Friedrich Neugebauer. And as we were saying before this event started, what would have happened if I'd said yes to Mike Parker and stayed at Linotype and then probably gone on from there to Bitstream? Who knows? But the really important presences in my life who taught me a lot about how to make things were my dad and Neugebauer, Dwiggins by example, Rocky Steinauer by direct contact, Samuel Chamberlain, another great New England artist. So if I had been able to maybe stay another year or two with Neugebauer, that would have led to a lot of interesting developments, I think.
Well, Bruce, thank you so much for coming to the Museum of Printing, participating in our Fireside Chat. We thank you very much.
A pleasure to be here and to see all of you. This is a piece that I did in, I think, 1978 or 79 on a material called Rubylith, which is a sheet of clear mylar over which a soft, almost gelatinous coating has been put on. I think it's actually it must be a petroleum product like polyethylene, I don't know. But anyway, it was used in the graphic arts, and it was made to produce this image as a hotel restaurant sign this big out in Framingham. So I cut this freehand using a Ulano swivel knife, and the outside was done. Rotring, the people who made rapidographs, also made a compass and with extensions so that you could use the Ulano swivel knife with a compass. So this was cut with that special Rotring compass, and the inside was all done freehand. Something I would never attempt with my 73-year-old hands, but back in the day, I was pretty sure-fingered.
It is absolutely beautiful, by the way. It's clean and sharp. If anyone has a question, now would be the time. Anybody have any questions for Bruce?
The question is, how many attempts did it take for me to cut this sign? You can't probably see it from the audience or from the camera, but this is spliced in.
Yes.
So the Delanos I did in one take, and then the outside was a separate operation, and then the two of them were taped together. So I did it just once. And this, in contrast with Matthew Carter, tells a wonderful story about the great French designer Roger Excoffon, who arrived at something like 11 or 11:30 at night at his apartment, and he was a wonderfully gesture-filled calligrapher, and he had a pile of arche or some kind of very expensive handmade paper and a big brush, and impeccably dressed in a three-piece suit, smoking his gitane. He did this about 90 times, each time taking a $1.50 piece of paper to select the one that he felt was the one that he wanted. And that was the way to capture both the form that he wanted and the freedom of gesture. In this case, where I knew that it had to be so controlled, I just set out to do it, and luckily didn't need to do it twice.
Yes, sir.
Had you practice it first on the paper, or?
Did I practice
Did you
it first?
practice
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
And the thing with the Ulano double cutter is that it sat on a tripod. The beauty of that is if you're using a calligraphic pen or any other kind of a tool, think of skiing. You lean into your turns. Well, if you do that with a double cutter, that means that one knife blade is digging into the mylar, which you don't want it to do, because this skim of red is super thin, and you want both knives to approach it in the same way. So Ulano made this wonderful little tripod with knurled sides that were easy to grip. And so what I had to learn to do was to use that double cutter absolutely dead flat. And I actually, when I was in Austria, I cut an entire typeface. My great friend Michael Neugebauer, who's son of Friedrich, if you look online for the name Litera, Litera, he designed that typeface. He was living in Salzburg at the time. I was in Linz. And an architect in Salzburg who had a very big architectural practice wanted his own custom lettering, which interestingly enough, he had made into Leroy templates. And Leroy templates were a way of doing mechanical lettering. And those edges are round because they use a rapidograph point in them. So it's a tiny disc flowing across the page, but Michael's letter forms were beautifully geometric and sharp edged. So that was lost in the translation with Leroy. But anyway, I cut that whole typeface with that same tripod. So if you look up Litera, you'll see URW later expanded it into many weights, but the original weight is the one that I cut in Rubylith.
Of the book projects that you've done, what are the challenges that you've encountered and how did you get past them? If you could maybe highlight one or two.
Yeah, the question there, what are some of the challenges in the book projects that I've done? I think the first challenge that comes to mind always is to meet budget. And how can the pictures and the type, all with me as the sort of conductor of the symphony, come out to the right number of signatures and end when they have to make the book affordable for whoever's paying for it. Another project that I remember that was fascinating was Rockwell Kent was interested in spending time with this woman a dancer from the Ziegfeld Follies. And he showered all these gifts on her. And one of them was this handmade book that he made at his house out on Monhegan Island off the coast of Maine. And no one knew it existed until it came up at auction in the 1970s. And the Baxter Society, a bibliophile group in Portland, Maine that I helped to found in 1984, got permission to do a facsimile of this. So we had to figure out how to imitate the Whatman watercolor paper that Kent had used in his original book in whenever it was, late teens, early 20s, on something that could be supported on an offset press and have sufficient sizing to work. So it had to have the right color, the right texture, surface texture, and the right behavior on press. And we tested about 10 different sheets. We ended up choosing something called L'An Aquarelle for that facsimile. And then that Steinauer produced that facsimile. I can't remember if they had their own bindery at that point or if Acme bound it.
What
But
was the year?
it was 89 or 90, something like that.
They didn't do much bindery at all up there, right?
It was probably us then.
Yeah. And there was a companion booklet, which we set on the linotype in Grandjean, and with photographs printed by Penmore, color photographs that I was able to go around and shoot a lot of this artwork that he showered on Hildegard, trying to get her to come and be his honey. So that was a fun and challenging project. And I guess it's always been trying to find materials and types that most suitably support whatever the spirit of the content of the project is. Well, thank you all for coming. It's great to be here today.
We appreciate it very much. Thank you.